koutou mā, ngā mihi nui nunui ki a koutou, ngā mihi ki a koe, kawan. Thank you very much for introducing us and doing our mihi. It's great to be here. I feel very much at home back here in this faculty. It's where I started out in my academic career, met my husband and then left. No. No, I do feel very much at home here, partly because my whānau has connections to this part of the world as well. So you'll see a very short title from me in the list that was made up yesterday. Since then I've had some further thought. And I've decided to talk about basically Māori COVID, Indigenous people's rights under international law, but I've called it Thickening Understandings of an Indigenous People's Rights to Self-Determination Through Dialogue Between Domestic and International Legal Orders. So focusing on the dialogue between international and domestic legal orders and Indigenous people's rights, thinking about what the experience of Aotearoa Māori and COVID could bring to that. It could have been called, I've got here, What a Mess, or Incoherence and Upwards and Downwards Lawmaking, but I did decide on dialogic approaches because it sounded so much more academic. I've got 3 points. The first one is really just context setting, and that's just to point out that Indigenous peoples have really suffered as a result of COVID-19 globally. With one example particularly drawn from the Navajo, but that could come from any place actually, except for potentially Aotearoa New Zealand, although we do have our own issues, but the devastating health effects on Indigenous peoples globally I just want us to touch upon. Secondly, a very quick assessment of New Zealand's response to COVID-19 from a Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples perspective and also a Treaty of Waitangi perspective, or Te Tiriti perspective, but I leave Tracy to delve into that a little bit further, and then talk about what I think is happening as a result of COVID to this dialogue between international and domestic legal orders with respect to Indigenous people's rights. It's a bit of a mouthful that probably reflects that I'm early on in my thinking, and certainly that final point, the main point, is quite sort of preliminary, and it joins up with some thinking that I've had in on another issue. But firstly, just to remind everybody of the impact of COVID-19 on Indigenous peoples globally, I thought I would focus on the Navajo because thanks to Carwyn, I had the opportunity to chair a session on COVID and American Indian and law and justice, and there was a particular professor there from the University of New Mexico who I think as a chair I've not often ended up nearly in tears, but the experience that the Navajo have had in particular is pretty sad. So just as some background, Navajo is probably the largest, certainly in territory, of almost 600 American Indian nations that exercise inherent sovereignty in the US and exercise self-determination. Its territory is bigger than 10 of the smallest of US states. So it's a large territory in the US that they have their sovereignty over. There are 300,000 members of Navajo, but only about 173,000 who reside on Navajo territories. Currently there's up to around 15,000 people who've been infected with COVID-19 in the Navajo territories, which is pretty large when you compare that to New Zealand with 5 million. And I don't know what our current figure is today, but certainly a very small proportion of that within the 173,000 people. At one point they had the highest COVID-19 infection rate compared to any state in the US, including New York at the very highest times. It's important to remember that the Navajo, while they exercise their inherent sovereignty, still suffer many of the consequences of colonisation. A third of the reservation population is without water. So that might seem pretty drastic, but you think about in a COVID crisis and you need people to go out and get water. So it's very hard to stop people moving when a third of the population doesn't have water, for example. Many people live in multi-generational dwellings. Unemployment's around 40%, very reliant on tourism, which is obviously ground to a halt as a result of restrictions on movement or not restrictions on movement, but people moving less. They, like other American Indian nations, receive quite a disproportionately low amount of funding from the federal income, and that's federal funding, and that is particularly acute in health. It's the first place, and as a result of COVID, where Medicine Sans Frontières went into what you might call in a first world country, and to provide assistance in response to COVID was into the Navajo reservation. There was, despite the impact of COVID on Navajo territories, when the Navajo government closed their borders, there was resistance from outside of Navajo territories, from Americans being worried about not being able to access Navajo lands. There was an interesting, in part of that panel discussion, there was also another lovely woman from the Shinnecock Indian Nation, and that nation sits between New Yorkers and the Hamptons, and some wealthy New Yorkers got pretty annoyed when they couldn't get to the Hamptons easily because the Shinnecock Nation closed their borders. It's a very busy government as a result of COVID, and they're doing a tremendous job despite the circumstances. But what it highlights, I think, for our purposes, is the vulnerability of Indigenous peoples to COVID, where you have poverty, you have poor health, you have underlying health conditions, and so on. And then you have a disease that comes in, and it can wreak havoc very quickly within Indian nations. It also highlights the need for a strong Indigenous governance. Part of the problem with federal funding that came in as a result of COVID was not only was it very late, but then there were federal government strings attached to that funding, which meant it was very hard for the Navajo government to do its work in looking after its people. So those are 2 points that I think we could take and think about some further. So my second point is this one around turning back to Aotearoa New Zealand, was how did New Zealand do with respect to sort of self-determination under the Declaration o Rangatiratanga, under our Te Tiriti. And I think there were positives and negatives that came out from that perspective. The positive was that you could see Māori, iwi and hapu exercising rangatiratanga and roadblocks and providing services to their communities, be it in our communities, be it health or food or so on. And also that while there was some public backlash to that, I think by and large the government didn't intervene. And that's really good, I think, certainly from a self-determination Aotearoa perspective. So allowed iwi to exercise their authority, and hapu and whānau to exercise their authority over our peoples. Quite good. On the other hand, and I think some of these issues will come up today, state regulation didn't adequately take into account Māori rights, particularly Māori to participate in governance and thinking about how the state might respond to the COVID-19 crisis. So you see that, and Jane's pointed that out in some of her writing, the lack of inclusion and consultation. I don't like the word consultation, but with Māori with respect to developing norms. You might explain that because it was an emergency situation, but I think by the time we got around to some of the more recent legislation, there was certainly ample opportunity for Māori to be included and for their perspective to be included. As a result, you got that issue around entering marae with warrantless searches and so on, those kind of issues coming up. Okay, so my third point, which I probably should have put first, note to self for next time when ordering these things, was that how does international law and come into all this? What can we say about this? And this is a preliminary comment. The first one is, the first point on which I'm thinking about this is that I think that international legal norms are developing with respect to Indigenous people's rights, particularly self-determination, as a result of this dialogue between domestic and international legal orders, both in a downwards way from international law talking to domestic legal orders, and in an upwards way from our domestic legal orders talking up. That might seem pretty obvious, but I think what's interesting about it from a self-determination perspective is self-determination is a pretty big prize in international law. It's a pretty important norm that is fiercely protected by states and also fiercely sought after by groups. And as we know, Indigenous peoples have a right to self-determination, but trying to put some meat on the bones of that right is something that is an ongoing process, and it's that upwards-downwards interaction that I'm interested in. You see it downwards, for example, when this special rapporteur, the expert mechanism or human rights treaty bodies are developing rights with respect to Indigenous peoples, particularly with respect to self-determination upwards. So we might see all the judicial comments made by our highest court, by the Supreme Court, not incorporation, sorry, that's the wrong word, being influenced by the declaration, by the Waitangi Tribunal being influenced by the declaration, and that you can see going up into international law. COVID. The point is really simple. It's that thanks, Dave. It's that COVID's really pushed that dialogue to the fore and made it sped it up. Because you've got Indigenous peoples, as a result of COVID, fiercely protecting their borders and fiercely protecting their autonomy, you have that happening and the international and the domestic legal order having to respond. You have that activity that's now going to be fed up into international understandings of self-determination. Equally, the expert mechanism, human rights treaty bodies, permanent forum, etc., have been very busy in trying to come up with responses and saying, well, stay out states, Indigenous peoples are better at responding to COVID for our own peoples. And that's going to then colour how we interpret self-determination moving forward. Kia ora. Thanks, Jane.